So I think we're on time. So welcome to my biblical nightmare, because this chapter 10 of St. Mark is not easy. I've already been at 2 masses this morning in a suburban parish, and I've already read this twice, and I've already preached on it twice. So I'll try to even make it more clear, if I can, to you out there in the cloud. So it says here, the Pharisees came up intending to give him a hard time. And they asked, is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? And Jesus said, what did Moses command? Because Moses was the be-all and the end-all of the Jewish religion, and apart from Abraham, of course, but Moses was the lawgiver, and the Pharisees were, in fact, the guardians of authentic Judaism, which they'd learned that they'd won the right to be the guardians, because they had kept Judaism alive during the 2 major exiles in the history, the first 1,000 years history of the Jewish people. The Pharisees, in fact, had put their hands up while the 2 exiles were on, far from Jerusalem and Judea and Israel, far. And while the Jews were in exile, wanted to keep their faith, they found it hard because they had no priesthood or temple, which were essential ingredients as far as the previous generation to them, and long before them was concerned. No priesthood, no temple, you had no Judaism. But in fact it couldn't work out, because you weren't anywhere near the temple or the priesthood. So in fact you had to reinvent yourself, and the Pharisees were the key players abroad in the diaspora in helping ordinary Jews to keep their faith alive. And they invented the little gatherings on Friday night through Saturday, which were called synagogues. And because there were no priests to offer sacrifices and no temple to do the sacrificing in, well, then of course they had to be creative, and they then learnt to gather wherever, no matter how difficult it was, to gather in 1, 2s, 3s, 4s, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, whatever like that. And they managed to retell the story of God's wonderful ways of dealing with these chosen people. And they went over and over that, and they recited David's Psalms and the famous quote, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, when our captors asked us to sing our local songs. So that's the kind of the environment in which the Pharisees became the guardians. Now back we are in Jerusalem or Palestine now. I shouldn't call it Palestine, I've been told 1,000 times, because it was the name given by one of the Roman emperors or governors to describe the Jewish people, and unfortunately I've got the habit of calling them the country Palestine, because this wretched Roman official decided to call the Jews by the name of their arch enemies, who were the Philistines. Palestine, Philistine. So one has to be careful. So here's Jesus about hundreds of years after the exiles, and he's confronted with these guardians, these people who had won the moral right to more or less guide the Jewish people in the countryside and everywhere else except in the temple, where the priests were still in control. And they said to him, is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? Now they're looking for a fight. Jesus said, what did Moses command? They said Moses gave permission to fill out a certificate of dismissal and divorce her. And Jesus said, Moses wrote the command only as a concession to your hard-hearted ways. In other words, you couldn't get on with one another. And in the original creation, he said, God made men and women to be together. And because of this, a man leaves the father and the mother, and in marriage he becomes one flesh with a woman, no longer two individuals, but forming a new entity. Because God created this organic union of the two sexes, no one should desecrate his art by cutting them apart. And when they were back home, the disciples brought it up again because it was a bit overwhelming. It was appeared to be so hard line. Jesus gave it to them straight. A man who divorces his wife so he can marry someone else commits adultery. And a woman who divorces her husband so she can marry someone else commits adultery. So it's a tough piece, but I mean, in the context of kind of tribalism and a group of people under enormous strain to stick together, it's one of those advisories that one gets from the best of friends who says, look, relationships are paramount in trying to build community, whether it's a religious community or a secular community. And secular society is going through difficulties here in my country, Australia, trying to make up its secular collective mind, whether it's going to have same-gender marriages, whether it's going to allow for divorces, even though they create difficulties with children. In fact, we had a very recent case in the news of a contested custody of 4 grown girls, daughters of a troubled marriage, when the father is in Italy and the mother is in Australia, and the 4 girls had been with the mother for ages. And yet one of the Australian courts ruled that the children had to be almost forcibly removed from the mother and sent to the father, because they'd only come to Australia to visit the mother for a holiday, and the mother and the girls had more or less conspired to keep them here. So there's a marriage in difficulties, and there are 4 adult children going through an ordeal that I guess you and I would say that they should never have been put through. But it's because of this kind of the vexed nature of relationships. And I think what your Jesus is in fact trying to say to the Jewish lawgivers, the Pharisees, and then repeated for his sake of his own disciples, who were anything but Pharisees, is, look, for heaven's sake, let's try to keep our relationships honest. If you're going to leave somebody just because you've got another girlfriend or another boyfriend, that's not good enough. That's just sheer, I can't say unadulterated adultery because it's a bit of a mouthful, but he says that's just bogus. That's a bogus situation. And you can't leave your wife or your husband just for those kinds of... But of course, and we now know in secular society, that secular society won't put up with relationships, especially if they're built on violence. So we've got a wife who says, my husband is beating me up, and you've got a husband who says, my wife is beating me up. You can't quote the Old Testament, the Torah, or you certainly can't quote this chapter 10 of St. Mark from Jesus as if this was a blanket approval of anything goes so long as it's marriage. That's just, you can't do that. You have to, in fact, when you come to a text like this, you have to retrofit it with common sense. Now, the absolutists will say that that's absolutely disgraceful. You can't tamper with the word of God. And I'm saying, well, sorry, but my understanding, especially of Jesus, and I mean, I can't speak for the Jewish religion, but for the Jesus movement, also known as the church, for better or worse, this text has got to be retrofitted, as did last week's test when he says if your right hand scandalises, you cut it off. He doesn't expect you to cut your hand off. Well, what does he expect? He expects you to use common sense. Common sense is telling us that, in fact, relationships have got to be our number one priority, and family is the building block of society, and yet there has to be an advisory that says if this relationship in fact is toxic and if it's poisonous, well then you may have to go to the civil or to the religious tribunal and take steps to dissolve it and start all over again. Anyway, that's the best I can do with Mark chapter 10 on this occasion, and thank you for joining me this morning. It's been my privilege to talk with you, and also we'll try to be on the air again, live streaming through church.tv sooner or sometime or other next Sunday, hopefully earlier than this.